The Crusades were a series of religious and military campaigns that spanned over 2 centuries, leaving an indelible mark on Europe. These wars, fought between Christians and Muslims over control of the Holy Land, reshaped the political, economic, social, and cultural landscape of medieval Europe in ways that would echo through history. The consequences of the Crusades extended far beyond the battlefield, influencing trade, technology, knowledge, and even the power structures of European society. Before the Crusades, Europe was a fragmented continent, dominated by feudalism and isolated from the wider world. The call to arms by Pope Urban II in 1095 ignited a wave of religious fervor, uniting European kingdoms under a common cause. This newfound unity, however temporary, laid the groundwork for stronger centralized monarchies in the future. Kings and nobles who participated in the Crusades gained wealth and prestige, weakening the feudal system and shifting power toward emerging nation-states. Economically, the Crusades opened new trade routes between Europe and the East. Italian. City-states such as Venice and Genoa flourished as they supplied Crusader armies and established lucrative trade networks with the Islamic world. The demand for exotic goods like spices, silk, and precious stones grew, leading to the rise of a merchant class that would later drive the Renaissance. The financial systems of Europe also evolved, with banking families like the Medicis gaining prominence through loans and trade. Culturally, the Crusades exposed Europeans to advanced Islamic knowledge in science, medicine, philosophy, and architecture. Scholars translated Arabic texts into Latin, reintroducing lost classical works from ancient Greece and Rome. This exchange of ideas laid the foundation for the intellectual revival of the Renaissance. European art and architecture also transformed, incorporating elements from Byzantine and Islamic designs, as seen in the Gothic cathedrals that began to rise across the continent. Socially, the Crusades fostered a sense of Christian identity, but also deepened divisions between the West and the Islamic world. The violent clashes and lasting animosities sowed the seeds for future conflicts. At the same time, the Crusades expanded European horizons, encouraging exploration and eventually leading to the Age of Discovery. In the long term, the Crusades accelerated changes that would define Europe's future, strengthening monarchies, expanding trade, and sparking cultural and intellectual growth. Though the Crusades ultimately failed in their goal of permanently securing the Holy Land, their legacy endured, shaping the course of European history forever. The Crusades, a series of religious and military campaigns spanning from the late 11th to the late 13th centuries, profoundly reshaped the political landscape of Europe. These expeditions, initially launched to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, had far-reaching consequences that extended beyond their immediate religious objectives. The Crusades altered the balance of power among European kingdoms, redrew political boundaries, and accelerated the decline of feudalism while strengthening centralized monarchies. The movement of armies, the establishment of Crusader states, and the interaction between diverse cultures all contributed to lasting political transformations across the continent. One of the most significant political effects of the Crusades was the weakening of the Byzantine Empire, which had long served as a buffer between Europe and the Islamic world. The Fourth Crusade, in particular, deviated from its original purpose and culminated in the sack of Constantinople in 1204. This event not only fractured Byzantine power, but also allowed Latin Crusaders to establish short-lived feudal states in former Byzantine territories. The fragmentation of Byzantine authority created opportunities for emerging powers such as the Venetians and the rising Ottoman Turks, who would later reshape the political dynamics of southeastern Europe. In Western Europe, the Crusades contributed to the consolidation of royal authority. Many feudal lords and knights, eager to gain spiritual rewards and wealth, sold or mortgaged their lands to finance their expeditions. This transfer of property often benefited monarchs, who seized the opportunity to expand their direct control over territories. Kings such as Philip II of France and Richard I of England used the Crusades to strengthen their positions, either by leading campaigns themselves or by managing the absence of rebellious nobles. The decline of feudal lordship and the rise of stronger centralized states became a defining feature of late medieval European politics. Moreover, the Crusades fostered new political alliances and rivalries among European kingdoms. The conflict between the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy, for instance, was influenced by crusading ideology. Emperors like Frederick Barbarossa sought to bolster their legitimacy by participating in crusades, while popes used the call to crusade as a tool to exert influence over secular rulers. Meanwhile, the Reconquista in Iberia gained momentum as Christian kingdoms, inspired by crusading fervor, pushed against Muslim rule, ultimately leading to the unification of Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella. The Crusades also had indirect effects on political boundaries through economic and cultural exchanges. The Italian maritime republics, particularly Venice and Genoa, grew wealthy by supplying Crusader armies and establishing trade networks in the Levant. Their economic power translated into political influence, allowing them to dominate key Mediterranean territories and shape the geopolitics of southern Europe. Additionally, the exposure to advanced Islamic administration and military techniques influenced European governance, contributing to the evolution of bureaucratic states. In summary, the Crusades were a pivotal force in reshaping Europe's political boundaries and kingdoms. They accelerated the decline of feudalism, strengthened monarchies, and altered the balance of power between Christian and Muslim territories. The legacy of the Crusades endured long after the last Crusader stronghold fell, influencing the rise of nation-states and the geopolitical order of the late medieval and early modern periods. The Crusades were a series of military campaigns launched by the Christian world of Europe against the Islamic East during the Middle Ages, and they had a profound impact on the European continent politically, socially, and economically. Among the most significant outcomes of these wars was the substantial increase in commercial activity and the strengthening of Europe's economic power. Before the Crusades, Europe lived in an era of relative isolation, with trade limited to a narrow scope within the continent or with some neighboring regions. However, with the launch of the Crusades, new doors opened for European merchants, leading to radical transformations in the European economy. As the Crusader armies moved toward the east, they were accompanied by thousands of soldiers, merchants, and pilgrims, creating an urgent need to supply provisions and goods to support these lengthy campaigns. Italian cities such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa benefited from this situation, providing the necessary ships to transport troops and equipment, and in return, they secured commercial privileges in eastern ports. Thus, these cities transformed into major trading powers, dominating the trade routes between east and west. With the establishment of Crusader states in the Levant, the flow of eastern goods into Europe increased significantly. Merchants brought spices, silk, precious stones, and luxury products that were previously unknown in European markets. Cities such as Acre and Tyre became vital trade hubs, where European merchants met their counterparts from the Islamic and Byzantine worlds. This exchange revitalized European markets and increased demand for Eastern goods, stimulating economic growth. Moreover, the direct contact between Europeans and the more advanced civilizations of the East led to the transfer of new knowledge and technologies. Europeans learned advanced techniques in agriculture and irrigation, as well as navigation tools and banking methods that were common in the Islamic world. These innovations were soon applied in Europe, contributing to increased productivity and facilitating commercial transactions. Additionally, the Crusades played a role in the development of Europe's banking system. Due to the need to finance distant campaigns, banking families such as the Medicis in Italy emerged, offering loans to Crusader leaders in exchange for financial guarantees. Systems of currency exchange and money transfers were also developed to facilitate the movement of funds over long distances. Thus, European financial centers became more sophisticated and capable of supporting large-scale commercial ventures. The role of the Crusades in reviving European cities cannot be overlooked. With the flourishing of trade, coastal and inland cities grew, becoming vibrant urban centers. A new class of wealthy merchants emerged, investing their money in building markets and ports, which strengthened the infrastructure of the European economy. The increased demand for goods also led to the growth of local industries, as European artisans attempted to replicate Eastern products to meet market needs. Thus, it can be said that the Crusades were a turning point in Europe's economic history. They broke the barriers of isolation and opened new paths for trade and cultural exchange. Through interaction with the East, Europeans were able to develop their economy and lay the foundations for the commercial revolution that later paved the way for the Renaissance. The Crusades, A series of religiously sanctioned military campaigns spanning from the late 11th to the late 13th centuries were not merely wars of conquest but profound ideological movements that reshaped the religious, social, and political landscape of medieval Europe. These campaigns, initially called by Pope Urban II in 1095, with the stated goal of reclaiming Jerusalem from Muslim rule, evolved into complex interactions between Christianity and Islam, as well as between Western and Eastern Christendom. The repercussions of the Crusades extended far beyond the battlefield, deeply influencing religious attitudes, fostering both piety and intolerance, and leaving a legacy that would echo through European history for centuries. Before the Crusades, Europe was a fragmented continent, struggling with internal conflicts, feudal divisions, and a church seeking to consolidate its authority. The call to crusade offered a unifying cause, one that promised spiritual redemption and earthly glory. The idea of holy war was not new, but the scale and fervor with which it was embraced marked a turning point in Christian thought. The Church, by endorsing violence in the name of faith, created a precedent that would justify later persecutions, not only against Muslims, but also against Jews, heretics, and other nonconformists within Europe itself. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, set the tone for what was to follow. The dramatic capture of Jerusalem in 1099 was accompanied by widespread slaughter, an event that shocked even some contemporary Christian chroniclers. This brutality was not merely a byproduct of war, but was often framed as divine justice against unbelievers. Such rhetoric reinforced the notion that religious difference was not just a matter of faith, but a justification for violence. Returning Crusaders brought back not only loot and relics, but also hardened attitudes, spreading tales of both the heroism and the supposed treachery of non-Christians. Meanwhile, the Crusades also intensified hostility toward Jews in Europe. Even before the armies reached the Holy Land, many Crusaders turned their violence inward, attacking Jewish communities in the Rhineland. These pogroms were fueled by a mix of religious zeal, economic envy, and the belief that Jews, as enemies of Christ, were legitimate targets. The Church's official stance was ambivalent. While some clergy condemned the violence, others tacitly encouraged it. This marked the beginning of a long and tragic history of European anti-Semitism, where crusading ideology provided a pretext for persecution. As the Crusades continued over the decades, their initial religious fervor became entangled with political and economic motives. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204, a Christian city, demonstrated how easily holy war could devolve into opportunistic conquest. This event deepened the schism between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East, embedding mutual distrust that persists in some forms to this day. By the late Middle Ages, the crusading ideal had waned militarily, but its ideological impact endured. The notion of a unified Christian identity, defined in opposition to external and internal others, became entrenched. The Inquisition, the persecution of heretics, and the eventual expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492 can all be seen as extensions of the intolerant mindset cultivated during the Crusades. At the same time, the Crusades also exposed Europe to new ideas, goods, and cultures, particularly through contact with the Islamic world. This interaction, though often violent, inadvertently laid the groundwork for the Renaissance by reintroducing classical knowledge preserved in Arabic texts. Yet, the dominant legacy was one of division. The Crusades taught Europe to view religious difference as a threat, a lesson that would shape centuries of conflict. In summary, the Crusades were a pivotal force in shaping religious attitudes in Europe, embedding both a militant piety and a deep-seated intolerance that would influence the continent's trajectory long after the last Crusader state fell. The Italian city-states played a crucial role in the economic shifts triggered by the Crusades, using their strategic locations, naval strength, and trade networks to control commerce between Europe and the Levant. From the late 11th century onward, cities like Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and Amalfi took advantage of the increased movement of crusaders, pilgrims, and supplies to the Holy Land, creating profitable trade routes that boosted their wealth and political power. Although the Crusades were primarily religious and military campaigns, they unintentionally spurred an economic surge that the Italian maritime republics expertly utilized, reshaping Mediterranean trade for centuries. Even before the Crusades, Italian merchants had begun rebuilding trade links with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, but the Crusades significantly accelerated this process. The need to transport large numbers of crusaders, pilgrims, and provisions to the eastern Mediterranean created vast opportunities for Italian shipowners. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, with their powerful navies, secured contracts to transport crusading armies in exchange for trade privileges, monetary payments, and territorial rights in key ports. These deals allowed them to establish permanent trading colonies in Crusader-controlled cities like Acre, Tyre, and Jaffa, where Italian merchants operated independently and enjoyed tax exemptions. The Italian city-states became essential middlemen in the exchange of goods between the East and West. High-demand luxury items such as silk, spices, dyes, and gemstones from the Middle East and Asia were sought after by European nobility, and Italian merchants monopolized their distribution. Venetian and Genoese traders purchased these goods in Levantine markets, shipped them across the Mediterranean, and sold them at high profits in European markets. The immense wealth generated from this trade funded the construction of grand palaces, churches, and infrastructure in cities like Venice, transforming them into flourishing centers of commerce and culture. Additionally, the Italian maritime republics used their economic leverage to negotiate advantageous treaties with both Crusader states and Muslim rulers. Venice, for example, obtained exclusive trading rights in Alexandria despite ongoing Christian-Muslim conflicts, showing how business interests often outweighed religious divisions. Genoa, on the other hand, built strong relations with the Byzantine Empire, gaining access to Black Sea trade routes that further extended their commercial influence. Competition between these city-states sometimes led to violent clashes, such as the War of St. Sabas between Venice and Genoa, which was fought over control of strategic trading districts in Acre. The financial advancements driven by Crusade-related trade also contributed to the development of modern banking and credit systems. Italian merchants pioneered new methods of funding long-distance trade, including bills of exchange, maritime insurance, and joint stock ventures, minimizing risks and maximizing profits. The fortunes amassed from Eastern commerce allowed Italian bankers to finance not only trade but also European kings and the church, further strengthening their economic and political dominance. In the end, the Italian city-states' expertise in Crusade-related trade set the stage for the commercial revolution of the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Their control over Mediterranean trade continued even after the Crusader states fell, as they adapted by forming alliances with the Mamluks and Ottomans. The lasting impact of their trade networks, financial innovations, and naval expertise influenced Europe's economic growth and the wider Mediterranean region for centuries. The Crusades, a series of religious and military campaigns waged by European Christians between the 11th and 13th centuries, left an indelible mark on the course of history. While their immediate goal was to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, their long-term consequences extended far beyond the battlefields of the Levant. The Crusades acted as a catalyst for profound transformations in European society, economy, and worldview, ultimately inspiring the age of exploration and conquest that would follow in the late medieval and early modern periods. One of the most significant ways the Crusades influenced future European expansion was through the exposure to new cultures, technologies, and knowledge. When European knights, merchants, and pilgrims traveled to the Near East, they encountered advanced civilizations, particularly the Islamic world, which possessed sophisticated science, medicine, navigation, and trade networks. The Crusaders brought back with them not only looted treasures, but also invaluable manuscripts, maps, and ideas that had been preserved and expanded upon by Arab scholars. This transfer of knowledge rekindled European interest in learning and innovation, laying the groundwork for the Renaissance and, later, the Scientific Revolution. Moreover, the Crusades stimulated European economies by reopening and expanding trade routes between East and West. The Italian city-states of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa grew wealthy by supplying Crusader armies and establishing commercial outposts in the eastern Mediterranean. The demand for exotic goods such as spices, silks, and precious metals fueled a growing appetite for long-distance trade. This economic shift encouraged European merchants to seek direct access to the sources of these riches, bypassing Muslim intermediaries. The desire to control trade routes would later drive explorers like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus to seek new sea passages to Asia, leading to the discovery of the Americas and the establishment of global empires. The military and logistical experiences gained during the Crusades also played a crucial role in shaping future European conquests. Crusader states such as the Kingdom of Jerusalem required complex administration, diplomacy, and warfare strategies to survive in a hostile environment. European nobles and knights learned to adapt to unfamiliar terrains, employ new siege techniques, and negotiate with foreign powers. These skills would prove invaluable in later colonial ventures, where European powers faced similar challenges in establishing and maintaining overseas dominions. Religious zeal, a driving force behind the Crusades, continued to motivate European expansion in subsequent centuries. The idea of spreading Christianity to non-believers justified conquest and colonization in the eyes of many Europeans. The Reconquista in Iberia, the Portuguese expeditions along the African coast, and the Spanish conquest of the Americas were all framed as continuations of the crusading spirit, holy missions to convert and subjugate non-Christian peoples. The papal bulls of the 15th century, which granted Portugal and Spain the right to claim newly discovered lands, echoed the Church's earlier endorsements of crusading campaigns. Finally, the Crusades fostered a sense of European identity and superiority that would underpin imperial ambitions. The confrontation with the Islamic world reinforced a binary worldview, dividing Christendom from its perceived enemies. This mentality persisted into the Age of Exploration, where Europeans viewed indigenous peoples of Africa, Asia, and the Americas through a lens of cultural and racial superiority. The Crusades thus helped forge an ideological framework that justified domination and exploitation in the name of religion, civilization, and economic gain. In conclusion, the Crusades were far more than a medieval religious conflict. They were a turning point that reshaped Europe's trajectory. By exposing Europeans to new knowledge, stimulating trade, refining military tactics, and fueling religious and ideological fervor, the Crusades set the stage for the great voyages of discovery and the eventual rise of European global dominance. The legacy of the Crusades can be seen in the explorers who charted unknown seas, the conquerors who built vast empires, and the merchants who wove the first threads of a connected world. The Crusades, a series of religious and military campaigns, waged between the 11th and 13th centuries, were not merely a clash of civilizations between Christian Europe and the Islamic world. They also served as a crucible for military, technological, and logistical advancements that would later shape the age of European exploration. The innovations developed during the Crusades, ranging from siege warfare techniques to naval navigation, had a profound impact on how Europeans would eventually venture into the unknown reaches of the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans. The interplay between crusading warfare and exploration reveals a fascinating continuity in which the tools of conquest were adapted to the challenges of discovery. One of the most significant military innovations of the Crusades was the refinement of siege warfare. European armies encountering formidable fortifications in the Levant were forced to adapt their tactics and engineering techniques. The use of trebuchets, mobile siege towers, and mining operations became more sophisticated, as Crusaders sought to breach the walls of cities such as Jerusalem, Acre, and Antioch. These advancements were not lost on later European explorers and conquerors. When the Portuguese and Spanish embarked on their campaigns in Africa, the Americas, and Asia, they often faced well-fortified cities and strongholds. The knowledge of siegecraft honed during the Crusades allowed explorers like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro to overcome Aztec and Inca defenses, despite being vastly outnumbered. The transfer of military engineering from the Holy Land to the New World underscores the lasting influence of crusading innovations. Another critical development was the evolution of naval technology. The Crusades necessitated the large-scale movement of troops, supplies, and equipment across the Mediterranean, prompting improvements in ship design and navigation. The Venetian and Genoese fleets, which played a crucial role in supplying Crusader states, developed more efficient cargo ships and war galleys. These vessels later became the prototypes for the carracks and caravels that would dominate the age of exploration. The Portuguese, in particular, borrowed from Mediterranean shipbuilding techniques to create sturdier, more maneuverable ships capable of long oceanic voyages. Additionally, the Crusades accelerated the adoption of the magnetic compass and astrolabe, technologies that had been known in the Islamic world but were perfected by Europeans during their campaigns in the East. These instruments became indispensable, for navigators like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus, enabling them to traverse vast distances with greater precision. Logistical organization was another area where crusading innovations left their mark. Supplying armies across vast distances required sophisticated systems of provisioning, communication, and supply chain management. The military orders, such as the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers, became adept at managing resources across multiple territories, establishing networks of fortifications and coordinating between distant outposts. This logistical expertise was later mirrored in the way European powers established and maintained overseas colonies. The Spanish, for instance, replicated the Templar model of fortified supply bases in their American territories, ensuring a steady flow of men and materials across the Atlantic. Moreover, the Crusades fostered a culture of cross-cultural exchange that indirectly benefited European exploration. Contact with the Islamic world introduced Europeans to advanced mathematical, astronomical, and cartographic knowledge. Arabic maps and geographic treatises, translated into Latin, expanded European understanding of the world beyond their immediate horizons. The works of scholars like Al-Idrisi, whose maps were studied by European navigators, provided critical insights into distant lands. This intellectual exchange laid the groundwork for the more systematic approach to exploration seen in the 15th and 16th centuries. The Crusades also had a psychological impact on European expansionism. The idea of a holy mission, whether to reclaim Jerusalem or to spread Christianity, persisted in the mindset of explorers and conquerors. The Reconquista in Iberia, which was framed as a continuation of the Crusades, directly preceded the voyages of Columbus, who saw his journey as part of a divine plan. Similarly, the Portuguese expeditions along the African coast were often justified as crusades against Muslim powers, blending religious zeal with territorial ambition. In conclusion, the military innovations of the Crusades, ranging from siege warfare and naval technology to logistical organization and cross-cultural knowledge, played a pivotal role in shaping European exploration techniques. The lessons learned in the Levant were adapted and refined, enabling Europeans to venture farther and more effectively than ever before. The Age of Exploration, therefore, was not an isolated phenomenon, but rather the culmination of centuries of accumulated military, technological, and strategic advancements that had their roots in the Crusades. The Crusades, a series of religious and military campaigns initiated by Latin Christendom between the 11th and 13th centuries, profoundly influenced European perceptions of the wider world. Prior to the Crusades, Europe's understanding of distant lands, particularly the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia, was largely shaped by fragmented accounts from ancient texts, rare travelers' tales, and the limited exchanges facilitated by sporadic trade. However, the sustained contact between Europeans and the diverse cultures of the Levant during the Crusades dramatically broadened their geographical, cultural, and scientific horizons. One of the most significant ways the Crusades expanded European knowledge was through direct exposure to the advanced civilizations of the Islamic world. Muslim societies at the time were at the forefront of science, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy, preserving and building upon the knowledge of ancient Greece, Persia, and India. European crusaders, merchants, and pilgrims who traveled to the Holy Land encountered sophisticated urban centers such as Jerusalem, Damascus, and Antioch, where they observed innovations in architecture, irrigation, and medicine that far surpassed those in the West. The presence of European settlers in the Crusader states further facilitated cultural exchange, as many adopted local customs, learned Arabic, and engaged with scholars. Trade flourished as a result of the Crusades, linking Europe more closely with the vast commercial networks of the Mediterranean and beyond. Italian maritime republics such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa established lucrative trade routes with the Levant, importing luxury, goods like spices, silks, dyes, and glassware that were previously rare or unknown in Europe. These economic ties not only enriched European markets but also introduced new tastes, technologies, and artistic influences. Moreover, the increased interaction with Muslim and Byzantine merchants provided Europeans with more accurate knowledge of distant regions, including Persia, India, and even China, laying the groundwork for later exploration. The Crusades also led to the transmission of scientific and philosophical texts that had been lost or neglected in medieval Europe. Through contact with Arab scholars, European intellectuals gained access to works by Aristotle, Ptolemy, Galen, and other classical thinkers, which had been preserved and commented upon in Arabic. The translation movement in cities like Toledo and Sicily, though occurring independently of the Crusades, was undoubtedly accelerated by the heightened cultural exchanges of the period. This influx of knowledge later fueled the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, transforming European education and thought. Another crucial aspect was the broadening of geographical awareness. Before the Crusades, many Europeans had only vague notions of lands beyond their immediate surroundings. The journeys of Crusaders, however, produced detailed accounts of the geography, climate, and peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean. Pilgrimage chronicles, such as those by Ceolwulf and John of Würzburg, provided descriptions of sacred sites alongside observations of local customs and natural phenomena. Over time, these narratives contributed to a more nuanced European understanding of the world, challenging earlier mythical or fantastical depictions of distant lands. Military encounters also played a role in expanding European knowledge. The Crusaders' campaigns took them through regions such as Anatolia, Armenia, and Egypt, exposing them to diverse political systems, military tactics, and technologies. The adoption of new siege techniques, the use of crossbows, and the introduction of advanced fortification designs were direct results of these interactions. Additionally, the Crusaders' alliances and conflicts with various Muslim and Christian factions, such as the Byzantines and Armenians, provided them with deeper insights into the complex political landscape of the Near East. Despite the often violent nature of the Crusades, the prolonged contact between Europeans and the peoples of the Levant fostered a degree of cultural assimilation. Many Europeans who settled in the Crusader states adopted Eastern clothing, cuisine, and even linguistic elements, blending Latin and Arabic influences. This cultural hybridity was reflected in art and architecture, where Gothic and Islamic styles merged in structures like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the castles of Crac des Chevaliers. Such exchanges demonstrated that the Crusades were not merely a clash of civilizations, but also a meeting point where knowledge and traditions flowed in both directions. The Crusades also indirectly spurred later European exploration. The desire to bypass Muslim-controlled trade routes after the fall of the Crusader states motivated European powers, particularly Portugal and Spain, to seek alternative paths to Asia. This drive eventually led to the Age of Discovery, with figures like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus drawing upon the geographical knowledge accumulated during the crusading era. The Crusades thus served as a bridge between the medieval and early modern periods, reshaping Europe's place in the world. In summary, the Crusades significantly expanded European knowledge of distant lands by fostering direct contact with the Islamic world, stimulating trade and cultural exchange, reviving classical learning, and enhancing geographical awareness. While primarily driven by religious and military motives, the Crusades inadvertently became a catalyst for intellectual and economic transformation in Europe, leaving a lasting legacy on its engagement with the wider world. The Crusades, a series of religious and military campaigns waged between the 11th and 13th centuries, were not merely clashes of faith, but also pivotal economic ventures that reshaped Europe's financial and geopolitical landscape. The wealth accumulated from these campaigns, whether through plunder, trade, or the establishment of commercial networks, played a crucial role in funding the subsequent era of European exploration and colonization. The transfer of riches, knowledge, and resources from the East to the West laid the groundwork for the Age of Discovery, enabling kingdoms such as Portugal, Spain, and later England to finance ambitious voyages across uncharted seas. When the Crusaders marched toward the Holy Land, their primary objective was religious conquest, yet the economic consequences of their campaigns were profound. The capture of Jerusalem and other key cities brought immense spoils, gold, silks, spices, and other luxuries that flowed back into Europe. Italian merchant republics, particularly Venice and Genoa, capitalized on this movement, establishing lucrative trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to the markets of the Levant. These cities became financial powerhouses, their banks and trading houses accumulating the capital necessary to underwrite future maritime expeditions. The Crusades also introduced Europeans to advanced navigational techniques and cartographic knowledge preserved and developed by Arab and Byzantine scholars. Maps, astrolabes, and compasses, once rare in the West, became more accessible, allowing sailors to venture beyond the familiar coasts of Europe. The Crusaders' exposure to the vast trade networks of the Islamic world revealed the potential for immense profit in direct access to the spice trade, bypassing the costly intermediaries who had long dominated the overland routes. As the Crusades waned, the financial infrastructure they helped create did not disappear. Instead, it was repurposed toward new ventures. The Portuguese, under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, sought to circumvent the Muslim-controlled trade routes by finding a sea path to India. The wealth accumulated from Crusader-era commerce provided the necessary funds to develop advanced ship designs such as the caravel, and to sponsor exploratory missions down the African coast. Similarly, Spain, freshly unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, redirected its resources toward transatlantic exploration, culminating in Columbus's fateful voyage in 1492, a journey financed in part by the spoils of the Reconquista, a campaign deeply intertwined with the crusading ethos. Moreover, the Crusades fostered a culture of expansionism and mercantile ambition that justified later colonial endeavors. The idea of conquering distant lands in the name of faith and profit, once tested in the Levant, was easily transplanted to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The same banking families that had funded Crusader expeditions, such as the Medici and the Fuggers, later invested in colonial ventures, seeing them as extensions of the lucrative enterprises begun centuries earlier. Thus, the wealth generated by the Crusades did not merely enrich individual knights or nobles, it transformed Europe's economic and intellectual foundations, enabling the voyages that would eventually bind the globe in a web of European empires. The gold of Jerusalem, the spices of Alexandria, and the maps of Constantinople became the seeds of empire, sown in the age of holy war and harvested in the age of exploration. The Crusades, a series of religious and military campaigns waged by European Christians between the 11th and 13th centuries, were not merely conflicts over sacred lands, but also profound encounters between vastly different civilizations. These interactions between Crusaders and the diverse cultures of the East, Arab, Byzantine, Persian, and others, ignited a transformation in European thought, commerce, and ambition. The knowledge, goods, and technologies brought back by returning, Crusaders and merchants gradually dismantled the insular worldview of medieval Europe, planting the seeds for the age of exploration. The Crusades, therefore, were not just wars of faith but also bridges between worlds, fostering curiosity, economic desire, and the eventual push toward global discovery. Before the Crusades, Europe was largely isolated, its knowledge of the East limited to fragmented tales and ancient texts. The Islamic world, by contrast, was a flourishing hub of science, medicine, and trade, preserving and advancing the works of Greek, Roman, and Indian scholars. When Crusaders marched into the Levant, they were exposed to cities like Jerusalem, Antioch, and Constantinople, centers of wealth, learning, and sophistication, far beyond anything in the feudal West. They encountered advanced medicine, refined architecture, intricate textiles, and spices that transformed European cuisine. These experiences shattered the notion of European superiority and revealed a world rich with possibilities. One of the most significant influences was the rediscovery of classical knowledge. Arab scholars had translated and expanded upon Greek and Roman texts, particularly in astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. When Europeans came into contact with these works during the Crusades, they were reintroduced to ideas that had been lost or suppressed in the West. This intellectual reawakening would later fuel the Renaissance, which in turn encouraged exploration, by reviving geographic studies from antiquity, such as the works of Ptolemy. Trade was another critical factor. The Crusades reopened and strengthened commercial routes between Europe and the East. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa profited immensely by supplying Crusader states and transporting goods such as silk, spices, and dyes. The demand for these luxuries grew exponentially, creating a European market dependent on Eastern trade. However, the eventual collapse of Crusader holdings and the rise of powerful Muslim empires made these routes perilous and expensive. This economic pressure became a driving force behind later European efforts to find direct sea routes to Asia, culminating in the voyages of explorers like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus. Moreover, the Crusades introduced Europeans to advanced navigational and maritime technologies. Arab and Persian sailors had long used tools like the astrolabe and magnetic compass, which were far more sophisticated than European methods of navigation. Exposure to these innovations allowed European sailors to venture farther with greater confidence. The Crusades also demonstrated the potential of coordinated large-scale expeditions, setting a precedent for the state-sponsored explorations of the 15th and 16th centuries. Beyond material and technological exchanges, the Crusades altered European perceptions of the world. Tales of distant lands filled with wonders circulated among returning soldiers and pilgrims, inspiring a sense of adventure and possibility. The travels of Marco Polo, though occurring after the Crusades, built upon this fascination with the East, further stoking European imaginations. The idea that vast wealth and knowledge lay beyond Christendom became a powerful motivator for exploration. In essence, the Crusades were a catalyst for Europe's eventual outward expansion. They broke down cultural barriers, revived lost knowledge, stimulated trade, and introduced new technologies, all of which were essential precursors to the age of exploration. While the Crusades were initially driven by religious zeal, their lasting legacy was the unintended consequence of connecting Europe to a wider world, setting the stage for the global encounters that would redefine history. The rise of papal authority during the Crusades marked a pivotal transformation in medieval Europe, shaping not only religious but also political and military trajectories for centuries to come. The Crusades, initially conceived as holy wars to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control, became a mechanism through which the papacy consolidated its influence over Western Christendom. This expansion of papal power did not end with the Crusades. Rather, it set a precedent that motivated later conquests, both within Europe and beyond, as successive popes and secular rulers sought to replicate its successes or exploit its ideological framework for their own ambitions. At the heart of this development was the Church's ability to mobilize vast resources, command armies, and legitimize warfare in the name of divine will. The call for the First Crusade by Pope Urban II in 1095 was not merely a religious appeal, but a strategic assertion of papal supremacy over European monarchs and nobility. By presenting the crusade as a penitential act that promised spiritual rewards, the papacy harnessed the fervor of the masses and the ambitions of knights and lords alike. This fusion of religious zeal and military endeavor granted the Pope unprecedented authority to direct the course of European warfare, an authority that would be invoked repeatedly in later campaigns. The success of the First Crusade, culminating in the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, reinforced the idea that papal-sanctioned wars were not only justified but divinely favored. This perception emboldened subsequent popes to expand the scope of crusading beyond the Holy Land. The Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars in southern France, the Northern Crusades targeting pagan Baltic tribes, and the Reconquista in Iberia, all drew upon the same ideological framework, the Pope's right to declare holy war against perceived enemies of Christendom. Each of these conflicts further entrenched the notion that conquest, when sanctioned by the Church, was both a sacred duty and a means of consolidating power. Moreover, the financial and administrative mechanisms developed during the Crusades became tools for later expansion. The Church imposed taxes, such as the Saladin tithe, to fund military campaigns, while the establishment of military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers created standing armies loyal to the papacy. These innovations were not confined to the Levant. They were adapted by later rulers to support their own conquests. The Iberian monarchs, for instance, utilized crusading privileges and church-backed financing to accelerate the Reconquista, while Teutonic knights employed crusading rhetoric to justify their expansion into Eastern Europe. The legacy of papal power during the Crusades also influenced the age of exploration. When European kingdoms turned their attention to Africa, Asia, and the Americas, the Church played a central role in legitimizing these ventures. Papal bulls such as Dum Diversas, 1452, and Inter Caetera, 1493, granted Portugal and Spain the authority to conquer and convert non-Christian lands, framing colonization as an extension of the crusading spirit. The conquest of the New World, though driven by economic and political motives, was thus presented as a continuation of the Church's sacred mission, ensuring that the expansion of papal power remained intertwined with imperial ambition. In this way, the growth of papal authority during the Crusades did not fade with the medieval era but evolved, providing a blueprint for later conquests. The idea that religious and political authority could be fused under the banner of holy war persisted, shaping European expansionism well into the early modern period. Whether through direct papal endorsement or the lingering influence of crusading ideology, the Church's role in medieval warfare left an indelible mark on history, motivating conquests that extended far beyond the borders of the Holy Land.